coming. When I arrived to the airport on Monday in San Diego, I found out that my flight was rescheduled 5 hours earlier, and so I was late. And while I was trying to figure out how I'm going to get here, just sort of envisioned this big sign on the door saying that lecture on predicting the future is canceled due to unforeseen circumstances. And so here you can see my credentials to speak about predictions. But let me start with the statement that it is really, really important for us to start thinking about the future and to thinking about how we think about the future. So I would start with the observation that Niels Bohr famously made, which is that prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. And this is a very, very important distinction, because when I talk about predictions, I'm not talking about a logical prediction, a deduction, but I'm talking about actually projection into the future. I'm talking about time. And it is also a very important thing to realize that thinking and social action requires us to think about the future. We cannot avoid thinking about the future. Any intentional act, and many unintentional ones, assume that you make certain predictions, you have certain expectations about the future, and humans are oriented towards the future. Now, we've seen in recent years a rapid growth in predictive technology due to advances in sensor and communication technology, data storage and processing capacities, and new powerful algorithms, especially machine learning, and then a new version of machine learning, which is hierarchical artificial neural networks. And these created some really spectacular advances in things like image recognition, or machine translations, or speech recognition. And now everyone is very, very excited what else they are going to be able to do. At the same time, when we have this incredible growth in predictive technologies, we also see spectacular prediction failure. We can start with the economic meltdown of 2007-2008. We can see the political meltdowns of Trump's election and Brexit and more. And there are also a series of unforeseen technological breakthroughs, and those consequences are also coming at us completely unexpected. At the same time, we also have not made too much advances in predictions in areas like earthquakes and weather prediction and epidemics. Now, there has been a general interest in the future in the social sciences, especially economics, has been trying to grapple with the problem of time and future expectations. However, much of the work until recently focused on rational expectations. Psychology in the last couple of years also got very, very interested in homo prospectus, the person who is thinking ahead, and there is a sort of an understanding that maybe the thing that differentiates humans from non-humans is their ability to look forward. Political science also got on this bandwagon. One of the most famous work was done by Philip Tetlock, who looked at how good pundits are predicting future events, and it motivated that project was partially motivated by everyone's inability to foresee the collapse of communism. I was one of those who didn't see it coming. So again, And also management science has been very, very active in this area. Sociology, interestingly, started out with a huge interest in the future. And in the 1920s, 1940s, until 1940s, most of the focus in sociology was whether we can predict individual behavior. And sociologists like Burgess and Duncan and others saw this as the proof of the scientificity of sociology. Then somehow that got abandoned, and in the 1960s and 70s, sociologists got interested in wide trends, catching the wave of history and making demographic and aggregate predictions. The last decade brought the concern with future back, and there are lots of interesting work that is now being done that was published in recent years. So the problem that I will try to address today is how should we understand the prediction in the context of a world that increasingly delegates predictions to machines. I will look at three areas of practice of making predictions about future individual behavior: credit, college, and crime. In all three, we find very similar problems delegated to humans versus and to machine algorithms. But what explains when we use art, human judgment, and what explains when we use algorithms? And again, algorithm is simply, the way I understand algorithms, it is a set of explicit instructions to produce output mechanically from a given input. So by this definition, a cookbook is an algorithm, an IKEA manual is an algorithm, but of course computer programs are the quintessential algorithms. So this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to have a little theoretical setup which will take us back in the past. Actually, we are going all the way back to Isaac Newton. Then I'm going to tell you about Newton's time and Laplace's demon. I'm also going to talk about various forms of prediction, and then the debate in cognitive psychology between clinical versus actuarial prediction. Then we will move to the present, and I'm going to talk about the trouble with algorithms in credit assessment, college admissions, and criminal justice. These will be, those are listed there, but I'm going to elaborate on those. And then we are going to move to the future, the new world of algorithmic governance, the coming of big data. And I will conclude. So I need to start with the clockwork universe. That is a term that was coined in a correspondence between Samuel Clarke and Leibniz, and which sort of described the way the 17th century understood the scientific, rising scientific knowledge understood the world. The key event in this was Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet was a phenomenon that impressed scientists for many, many generations, and proved that Newton's theory can predict outcomes way into the future. It gave self-confidence to the Enlightenment that prediction is possible, and scientific prediction is possible. Edmund Halley was the astronomer royal of England, and he used Newton's theory of gravity to predict in 1705 that in 1758 the comet will reappear. It appeared a little later in 1759, but it did, and it was a huge event in scientific predictions. Haley was also interested in predicting social behavior. He was one of the first people who created an actuarial table for life annuities, which he based on data from the city of Breslau. And he tried to calculate how much money governments should collect from people to pay out upon their deaths. Another person who was very, very much involved with the annuities and predicting human lifespan was a Huguenot who fled from France to Britain, Abraham de Moivre. And Moivre worked out the mathematics of annuities, but he also was famously one of the first people who described the normal distribution, the bell-shaped normal distribution. And he understood that the stability that comes from these random events that you can just describe as a bell-shaped curve is the sign of the divine. That is, the fact that you can create order at a higher level from small random events was the proof that God existed. He also was very interested in predicting his own death, which he did successfully. And he used the following algorithm. He said, well, clearly sleep is like dying. And if you measure how much more you sleep each night, then you can actually extrapolate from this the time of your death. And he successfully died on November 27th, 1754. And that was exactly what his algorithm predicted. In the following centuries, the person who was very, very impressed with Halley's comet was Pierre-Simon Laplace. And Laplace, with de Moivre, did lots of statistical work trying to establish these mathematical predictabilities in a very, very chaotic and unpredictable 18th century world. And then for Laplace, who sort of survived the French Revolution, he actually got to live into the 19th century. This is also the time when sociology, as we know it, was born, and Auguste Comte, Adolphe Quetelet, and the other pioneers were very, very impressed with Halley's comet and also with Newton's physics. And they called the new discipline that later became sociology social physics. And social physics then sort of got its name sociology from Auguste Comte. And then this sort of prediction, preoccupation with prediction became one of the key engines of the growth of the discipline at the end of the 19th century. Now, what did social scientists buy into? What was the thing that they sort of swallowed with Newton's physics? What they did swallow was a peculiar notion of time. One of Newton's great achievement was that he developed a new concept of time, which was decontextualized, linear, objective, universal, and uniform. And very importantly, past, present, and future in this world was meaningless. What you had was only events following each other. There was an order to these events, but there wasn't anything special about the present. There was nothing special about the future or the past. Because time was symmetrical. There is nothing in Newtonian physics that would not allow you to turn the equations around and see everything in reverse. So there is no direction in Newtonian time, and when there is no direction, prediction is easy, because you are simply taking something from one place and then you try to figure out where it would go in another place. In fact, the metaphor for time in Newtonian physics is a spatial metaphor. Future and past in that world is like left and right. It is a distinction of no importance. And there's also no novelty in a world like this. There isn't anything genuinely different about the future than about the past, than what you already have in the past. So time travel is actually a possibility. And H.G. Wells' famous book, which comes out a few years before Einstein's 1905 paper on special relativity, plays out this idea. It basically says, well, basically time is just a fourth dimension. It is like the other three spatial dimensions, and if that's the case, then of course you can travel. You can go up and down, you can go back and forth. Maybe it is not as easy to go forward than going backward, but going up is more difficult than jumping down. So ever since then, time travel became sort of this fascination in literature. The person who sort of summarized the vision that sort of emerged from Newton's physics was Laplace and his famous demon of predictive determinism. And I want to read this to you because the parts are important. So in his philosophical essay on probabilities, where he actually earlier talks about Halley's Comet, he says, we may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect, this is his demon, the intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion, and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, if this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intelligence, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. So what Laplace says is that if we had all the relevant facts or data and the right formula or algorithms and sufficient computational capacity, that's the intellect, the future can be predicted with certainty. This is the vision that social physics bought into, and this is the vision that is now resurrected with the incredible advances of predictive technologies. And there are already new books and works that are returning to this preoccupation with prediction, even at the individual level. Now, of course, Newton's physics got challenged in many, many ways. And I just wanted to sort of list a few of those that I think are very, very important. And all of those question whether this world of symmetrical time is the correct one. One of the most important piece comes from physics, from Ludwig Boltzmann and his second law of thermodynamics that challenges the symmetry of time. This is why you cannot pour a jug of wine into the ocean and then expect to collect the wine back to the jar. It's an irreversible process of entropy. The second interesting challenge around that same time comes from Henri Poincaré, the French polymath, mathematician and scientist, who tries to write a paper on the three-body problem and then discovers chaos theory. And then sort of that becomes sort of the nonlinear systems become sort of the bane of weather predictions and a lot of other things that we now study under complexity. The third one is Einstein's special theory of relativity. I don't want to talk about this, but obviously the fact that time can contract, which comes from Lorentz, that is something that is not compatible with Newton's universal uniform time. And then there are philosophical challenges to this from Karl Popper, who, among other things, points out that because the future also depends on knowledge, human knowledge, we really cannot know the future with certainty, because that would assume that we have the future knowledge today, in which case, of course, the future knowledge would not be future knowledge, but it would be knowledge of the present. And one of my favorite ones, Henri Bergson, and his notion of creative evolution and intuition. So there were lots and lots of attacks on this, of course, and quantum physics and lots of other things. I just don't want to sort of leave you with the idea that serious philosophers of science and physicists would embrace this kind of Laplacian world. But a lot of what we see in sociology does. Okay, so when we talk about prediction, again, I want to make this distinction between predicting the future, and then making a logical deduction. So saying that, that from this theory, I would predict that this thing happened, or this thing is happening. And there are many types of predictions, and I just want to sort of give you three dimensions that sort of separates them. Some of those we will find useful. One dimension is the problem definition. There are predictions which are selective, and then there are others that are explorative. Selective predictions select from a set of options, whether there will be rain or not, or no rain. While explorative predictions try to explore what are the possible outcomes. What is the universe of possible outcomes? So work on the consequences of global warming is much more explorative than selective. The next one is the agency of the prediction. There are, again, this is very, very important, that there are predictions which are adaptive. We predict an outcome external to our prediction, and then we just wait to see what happens. So when you are betting, for instance, on an event far away, something that you cannot influence, that is a case of adaptive prediction. Transformative predictions are predictions where your prediction actually can influence the outcome. So these are the cases of self-fulfilling and self-frustrating prophecies. Medical prognoses, for instance, are an example of transformative predictions, because the doctor predicts that you can die of this disease, and these would be the possible outcomes to prevent this from happening. No doctor would be happy to see his prediction come true if the prediction is a deadly disease. And finally, we also can distinguish between pragmatic and cognitive predictions. Pragmatic predictions are when we predict ultimately to take action to reap benefits or mitigate costs. Cognitive predictions are when we predict ultimately to change mental states. So, for instance, guessing the end of a story would be an example of the second kind of prediction. Or people doing genetic testing for incurable diseases could be a means to relieve anxiety. Okay? All right, so not all predictions are the same. And there has been a huge debate and argument about predictions and the art and the science or algorithmic form of prediction. That started with a book in 1954 by Paul Meehl, a cognitive psychologist at the University of Minnesota. And this is a sort of tiny little book which then generated a huge amount of research. And he distinguishes between clinical and actuarial predictions, where clinical predictions are what doctors do, internists do, while actuarial predictions is what, say, an epidemiologist would do, trying to sort of use statistical methods to predict the kind of sickness people have. You can also see this in many, many other situations where you have both forms, and this is what I'm going to show you once we get to the three C's: credit, college, and crime. Human experts use clinical judgment, and this clinical judgment works with uncertainty. They are looking at heterogeneous and dissimilar and unique, potentially unique cases. They try to reduce the complexity of the information by, in the process of solving the problem. And they make a judgment which has certain elements of discretion. These decisions are case specific. They are about a single case. And they usually use causal narratives to justify why they think that this is going to be the outcome. Actuarial predictions are different. They are about risk, which can be quantifiable. This is about homogeneous cases that you can aggregate. It is always about a set of cases as opposed to an individual case. You use information which is very wide as opposed to in-depth. You reduce the complexity of the problem by when you frame the problem. You decide what are the main variables, what are the main components. Your decision is always specific to a category, not to an individual. It is always specific to a certain type of cases. And the justification always relies on correlation, not on causation, not on causal explanations. So, for instance, if you take, say, psychiatrists who are sitting at the head of the bed while the client is talking, doing talk therapy, is a prime example of clinical decision making that he has to make. And a psychologist who is using different tests and then calculates likelihoods, for instance, of the person committing self-harm or a person recovering, would be an example of actuarial or algorithmic decision making. So what actuarial models do, they mechanically project past information into the future. That's what algorithms do. All right. So this created a huge research program. And in 2002, an article in the Philosophy of Science was published with the following title: 50 years of successful predictive modeling should be enough. They basically said, okay, this program is now over. We know the truth. There is absolutely no reason to do more studies because Meehl was right all along. A properly developed and applied actuarial model is likely to help in diagnosing and predicting human behavior as well or better than the clinical method, even when clinical judge has access to equal or greater amounts of information. There was a meta-analysis, there's many, many meta-analyses of hundreds of articles that showed that only in very, very few cases could experts and the art do better in predicting outcomes about humans than even a simple linear model. Even a model that is misspecified is doing much better, as long as the model gets the signs right. So things has the right plus and minus signs. They looked at this in terms of predicting academic performance, medical events, psychiatric symptoms, job performance and turnover, business success, criminal recidivism, marital satisfaction, lots and lots of things, everything that you can imagine, where they could set up an experiment where you would have two groups, two predictions, one from experts and one from some statistical model. Statistical models did better in predicting the future outcomes. And the argument was that formalized prediction is more accurate. Well, what they found was that more accurate, more reliable. It's not vulnerable to cognitive fallacies and limitations, not vulnerable to subjective prejudices and biases, and they are same but better. If an expert makes a claim that, well, this model does not consider this thing, then the model maker just happily adds that to the model. As soon as, so if anyone tries to argue with them, they would just say, okay, tell me why, tell me what's missing here. And then we are going to add this to the model. So this was the triumph of social physics. These actuarial models did better than humans. Now, let me sort of give you away some of the punchline, because it is clear that there is something wrong with this. Because you know, if you just think about it, if you would have to make a prediction that would say involve your plans about marriage, I doubt that any of you would leave this to a statistical algorithm. Or even when you had to decide, you know, what career to take, you are unlikely to have come to this conclusion, or would want to come to this conclusion using a statistical model. Those could be helpful, but in the end you would want to make the decision. So it turns out that for this kind of predictions to work, you have to have a set of conditions. And these conditions, of course, are conditions that also happen to be the same conditions that will get your paper published in a scientific journal. You have to have a clear problem definition. And that's exactly like with Halley's Comet. It's very clear that what you are predicting is only the time when the comet gets closest to Earth. That's your outcome. That agency doesn't exist, so the person who makes the prediction cannot manipulate the outcome, nor does the predicted try to manipulate the outcome in knowing the prediction. That again, I mean, Halley's Comet works very nicely within this within these limitations, because even though Halley might make his prediction public, the comet did not take any cognizance of it and did not change its course because just wanted to stiff Halley. And of course, the predictor also, Halley could not influence the comet's trajectory. So, what would we expect if Mail's project indeed delivered the truth to us? We would expect people that given that algorithmic predictions are superior, they would use them when the stakes are very high, and they wouldn't use them when the stakes are lower, or would be less likely to use them when the stakes are lower. We would also expect that when we have a large N, when we have lots of cases that are comparable, we would use algorithms because of cognitive limitations. So now I would like to take you to the present. This is sort of this was the setup. And I want to talk about 3 areas where predictions are being made about individuals. And then there are consequences to these predictions. The first one is credit assessment. When you apply for a loan, you are going to be assessed on the likelihood of paying this loan back. This is the same problem that colleges face when they admit some students and they have to decide whether the student is going to be a good student and could take advantage of the education that is being delivered to him or her. And finally, in criminal law, parole officers have to decide whether to release somebody after a certain number of years or keep in prison for a while based on what they expect this person is going to do once this person is out. Now, in each case we have a puzzle. And the puzzle is this. Why do we use actuarial methods in credit allocation, credit assessment, for small amounts of money, while for larger amounts we don't? And when you apply for a credit card with a credit line of a couple of $100,000 forints, you are put through a statistical model, and then that gives the bank the decision. On the other hand, if a huge company, and now let's sort of move outside Hungary for obvious reasons, and let's just say General Motors is applying for $100 million to some of the big American banks. They're not going to make this decision using statistical models. They are going to consult certain statistics. But there is going to be a committee, and that committee is going to debate and deliberate. And then they are going to make a judgment. If Mayer were right, you would expect that GM would get its money through a statistical algorithm. Now, also think about this a little bit. Companies are really well documented. They have, unlike you and I, they are tracking all their spending and all their money and everything. They have an accounting department. So the measurements are much, much more precise in that case than when you apply for a loan and where you cannot even tell how much money you made last year altogether. And you just guess on the paper. So you would think that the conditions of statistical predictions for algorithms would be much, much better for large companies than for fallible humans. For college, the question is, why do we admit undergraduates based on actuarial algorithms, while professors are always hired on the basis of clinical criteria? So we can admit undergraduates using very simple algorithms. It says, okay, so if they got this on this test and this on that test, then they are in. If not, then they are out. But we would never hire a professor saying that, okay, so now we are just going to calculate the number of articles and then we are going to weight that by, it was tried, but it never worked. We weight that by the citation, the impact factor, and then we multiply books by this much, and then we count the number of pages, and then the algorithm will give you whether this person has to be hired or not. Okay? So you don't do that. Finally, why do we convict people on the case of specific arguments? You cannot convict someone saying, well, taking all the data about this kind of thing, this person has a 95% chance of having committed this crime. Your Honor, I rested my case. Okay? That wouldn't go anywhere. You have to show that this person actually committed something, that this person is guilty. On the other hand, when the person applies for applies for parole, you can say that this person has a 65% chance of recidivism. And that's about 15% higher than the average, and therefore we are going to deny the parole. Okay, so I just want to show you that it is indeed true, at least in the United States, that people, little people who are borrowing small amounts, are judged by algorithms, and big companies are judged by judgment and art. This comes from Experian, who is one of the credit agencies for consumer credit and consumer borrowing. So they explained the credit scores, and they said credit scores, before credit scores, lenders physically looked over each applicant's credit record to determine whether to grant credit. A lender might deny credit based on a subjective judgment that the consumer already held too much debt or had too many recent late payments. Not only was this time-consuming, but also human judgment was prone to mistakes and biases. And our scores are consistent and objective. Equifax, which is another of the credit rating agencies, says the credit score is a result of mathematical formula. Okay? And it's not us who give you that score, it comes from the machine. Okay? Algorithm did it. What do corporate lenders say? Standard & Poor's says credit ratings for companies are opinions about credit risk. Our ratings express our opinion about the ability and willingness of an issuer, such as the corporation or state or city government, to meet its financial obligations. Credit ratings are not absolute measure of default probability. Since there are future events and developments that cannot be foreseen, the assignment of credit ratings is not an exact science. Fitch says, ratings are not facts and therefore cannot be described as being accurate or inaccurate. College admissions. Again, you see this sort of two types. Greg Mankiw argues that we have to have a very objective and impartial algorithmic system. While one of the deans of admissions at another university says that the admission process is imprecise and subjective. So why is that? So one of the problems that the predictors face is the fact that the problem that they are tackling is not as simple as I try to that I led you to believe. What does a lender want when they are assessing? It's not just whether you pay the money back. They want to minimize default, that's true. But they also maximize their profit. And that's not necessarily the same thing. In fact, in the United States and also in Hungary, people who pay always on time on their cards are really a loss-making for banks. Banks like you carry interest on your credit card because that's how they make money. It also tries to maximize consumer spending. And it also tries to maximize customer base. When they decide to give out a card, one of their consideration is to grow their customer base to outcompete the other cards. In fact, what they are actually doing, the way that credit scoring is set up is in Hungary, as well as in the US and in most places, is that they punish you for late payment. Not for default. For default, there is also a punishment, but late payment, which is 90 to 120 days being late on your payment. And what that is actually, it is trying to minimize careless behavior. It is basically an educational enterprise. What banks try to do is to teach you to be on time. And if you think about this economically, this makes absolutely no sense because they are basically creating a public good, right? To the extent to which they are really interested in having people paying on time, the fact that they are educating customers who might go to another bank, they are basically helping out their competition. In college, yes, colleges try to maximize capable students, but they also try to maximize talent utilization. So this is why they are so interested in diversity. They try to minimize inequalities because they know that society has an interest in alleviating inequalities. They also try to maximize revenue, and they also try to maximize information about the students and what they are doing. This is a constant problem that if you do your decisions well, you are going to get rid of those people who you think are not worthy. And, but you never find out whether they actually would have done well. And so you actually won't be able to make a comparison and see whether you are, your selection process is correct. Finally, with crime, you try to minimize recidivism. Yes, that's true, but you also try to maximize prison discipline. You try to minimize prison cost and overcrowding, so you would want to have as many people out as possible because it's very expensive to keep prisoners in prison. You also want to minimize political cost because if you release somebody and then it turns out he does something terrible that will have political blowback, you also want to maximize information. So algorithms require a very precise problem definition with clear outcome measures. And when you don't have that, when you have multiple competing problem definite objectives, and you cannot really clarify exactly which one you want to, and how you can measure each, and you cannot assign clear relative weights to your preferences, then algorithms are in trouble. Okay, so as I told you, there are all these problems there are all these different ways that banks could think about giving you a loan. And here I just want to show you how scoring works. So basically any scoring is based on the idea that you have a set of input variables and then you have an output, and these two are connected with a link function. And basically these algorithms are their link function. They are the ones that sort of link the input and the output. So here you can see there are these variables that they know in advance about people, and then there's an outcome that they don't know in advance about people. But what they can do, they can go back in time and they can collect even earlier data for the predictors and then an outcome which happened in the past. Then use some link function to fit the outcome. And then once someone comes in and you still don't have an observation on the outcome, you could use the weights or you could use the model to make a prediction. So that is basically how algorithms work. And there's zillions of different link functions that you can use. And this is one of the first problems. Until recently, none of these were better than the others in all cases. Now we have some very, very powerful algorithms which outperform these. The problem with those is that you cannot interpret them. There's absolutely no way you can translate what's happening inside the machine, the mathematics, to credit or creditworthiness. Here you can still do it because with the weights you can sort of say that, okay, the amounts owed has a bigger weight, so that's a more important factor. But with machine learning and with neural networks, there is nothing you can say. So the problem is that there are, if you don't go with machine learning, but you go with interpretable models, you have a choice. You can choose which one you want to choose, which model you want to choose. And there are consequences which one you choose. Even if two models predict exactly the same to the same extent. The mistakes are different. And if you are the mistake, it makes a huge difference for you. Furthermore, there are two types of mistakes that the machine, that these models make. One is people who are false positives. So people who are given a loan but they don't deserve it. And then people who are false negatives. People who could have got given the loan but were rejected by the system. Which one of these you want to maximize is another question that you have to decide in advance. And the problem is that if you are not letting the model just pick it, then you are going to have a worse fit. It's a decision that you have to make. It's another decision that you have to make. It also turns out that if using multiple functions is not a solution. So the fact that if you cannot be certain about those that all, say, 3 different functions predict. Many of those things that where functions agreed turn out to be wrong. So what's the problem here? It turns out that the model requires a series of human decisions. And these are, in many ways, these are art dressed up as algorithms. The selection of the variables, the selection of the way that you decide to measure them. All of these are decisions that go into the algorithm, and they are covered then up by the mathematical form. You also have a problem of self-fulfilling prophecy and performativity. Is another word that the literature uses. So the past behavior is the main input. So we are working with Newtonian times. So Newtonian times, it doesn't matter if things happened in the past, you can use it to predict the future. So the patterns of the past, of course, could include irrelevant inequalities, discrimination, and injustice. This is why now a huge literature is emerging on algorithmic fairness. Because what algorithms do, they take data from the past, which is fraught with social problems, then project it in the future, reproducing many of those same social problems. If you were discriminated against by lenders in the past, and you could not, therefore, get the loans at the terms that you needed to be able to pay it back, that your record is going to show that. And the model will say that you are not going to be a good debtor in the future. This is further exacerbated with risk-based pricing. Banks are moving from denial to risk-based pricing, which means that it is not that they don't give you the loan. It is that it's more expensive for you to get a loan if your history is bad. Which means that, of course, your chances of defaulting is larger because now you got it with worse conditions. And then, of course, that will create a downward spiral where you have to borrow to be able to pay it back, and then you won't be able to pay it back, so you will have to borrow more, and the terms are going worse and worse. And then there's also a positive feedback loop. So it is not just a downward spiral, it's also an upward spiral. If you start out in a good place, then you are going to get better terms. It will be easier for you to pay it back. Your history is going to be better, and the next time you are going to get even a better term. So what you have is, you have an upward spiral and a downward spiral, and you can see that the mechanical algorithm that is taking the past and projects it on the future achieves a polarization. And that's what's happening in many, many other areas. These positive feedback loops, these self-reinforcing processes, create growing inequalities. Now, it is not that people don't have ways to fight back. And this is one example I published in a paper on gaming the system. Credit scores were secret until 2002, when California made it mandatory to disclose it. And then people started to learn about their credit scores. And by now you will find hundreds and hundreds of websites which tell you how to game the system, how to fix your credit score, how to improve your scores without doing much about your financial situation. And what happened was, and this is one of the reasons why we had the financial collapse in 2007, 2008. It started with the mortgage crisis. For years, people were saying, well, this lending is really crazy, mortgage lending is really crazy in the US, it should be stopped, or at least, I'm sorry, it should be pulled back, and we should sort of cool down a little bit. And the Federal Reserve from 2005, 2006 consistently defended on more and more aggressive lending, mortgage lending, on the basis that credit scores were going up of those people who were borrowing money. So clearly there's no problem. These are more reliable borrowers. Turns out that when the collapse happened, they found out that the difference between those who defaulted and those who didn't in their credit score became tiny. In fact, it's from a scale of 300 to 950, it is, as you can see, for 2006, it's only 10 points. Okay? What happened was that people figured out how to game the system, and exactly those people who shouldn't have gotten the mortgage by the logic of this whole process could up their scores to the point where they would get it, and then, of course, they couldn't cope with the collapse. So, college admissions. In Hungary, we have a simple, fairly simple algorithm. At the UC San Diego system, it's a little more complicated because it takes the standardized scores and your high school points average, and then adds a bunch of other things which are scored in a very, very sort of scrupulous way. You can get, say, certain points for volunteering in the community service. You can get certain points for having special talents and achievements. You can get points for demonstrated leadership. You get points for generation, college attendance. All of these things are added to your score. And if you got maximum on all of them, you would have 11,000 points. Okay? But usually no one gets all the points. The cutoff point is around 7,000, 7,500. That's, if you are above that, you are in, and if you are below that, you are out. And until recently, this was completely mechanical to the point when I was the chair of undergraduate admissions at UC San Diego, we admit about 16,000 students every year to get a class of 4,000. Not a single parent came to me to protest or ask me for favors. Okay, so how well does this system work? Well, we can measure that by looking at the end of first year GPA at UCSD. Okay? And so if you look at that, if you take all the scores, if you calculate the scores the way that we are calculating, you will find a correlation of 0.395. So about 16% of the variation is explained by our score of how well the students are doing at the end of the first year. As you go further back, it's getting less. Here you can see, actually, if you take all the information and you do an optimal fitting, just using a linear regression, you explain about 27% of the variation, but all of those, but that assumes that you are willing to punish people for poverty, because that's a negative predictor, and also willing to punish for not having parents who went to college. Okay? And so all sorts of other things which are clearly unacceptable. The point here is that we know very, very little about those students. And we cannot really very well predict how they will do. And using this mechanical system sort of creates sort of a semblance or a facade of scientificity. Now, there are several reasons why we have such a bad prediction. It has to do with self-fulfilling prophecies, which is that the university is, so actually this could be worse if those things didn't happen. For instance, the system is tracking students on the basis of these standardized tests, and the university then evaluates them on the basis of these standardized tests. There are also self-frustrating prophecy elements where people can sort of act against it, like gaming the system, which is prepping for the test, pulling strings, which didn't happen to me, but could happen in other places, cheating, all sorts of other things. What we found was that the people who got in at the cutoff, just above the bar, were people who were richer than average and had more academic background in their family than the average. Those were the ones who the parents pushed through this barrier and who just got in, and then of course they didn't do so well. We also have had a natural experiment, because you can get into the UC two ways. You can get in through this system, or you can just go to community college, do 2 years there, and if you get a B+ or better and take the right classes, you are in. You are in UCSD. So we compare those students. Obviously, this is not a random sample of those who have applied, but these people are people who did not qualify to get into UCSD and then got through this back door. We found out that they did exactly as well, on average, than the students that we carefully selected. Okay, there are colleges now that are making standardized scores optional. So here is the no less than the University of Chicago. Okay? So you have to write essays now. Of course, they are looking at your scores as well. It's a very selective place. It's about 8% of the people, 8 to 10% of the people who get in. And it's very, very selective. So here's an essay, for instance. Prompt. The late New York Times photographer Bill Cunningham once said, "Fashion is the armor to survive the reality of everyday life." I don't think you could do away with it. It would be like doing away with civilization. Tell us about your armor. Okay, this is one. Fans of the movie Sharknado say that they enjoy it because it's so bad it's good. Certain automobile owners prefer classic cars because they have more character. And recently, vinyl record sales have skyrocketed because it is perceived that they have a warmer, fuller sound. Discuss something that you love, not in spite of, but rather due to its quirks and imperfections. Okay? These are the kind of things that students who want to get into Chicago have to do. So what does Chicago say? Why are they doing this? Again, I want to emphasize that if you don't hit a certain level of grades, you are not eligible really to get in. But then there's a huge band within which these things decide. Well, first, test taking directs students to expensive preparatory courses, reinforcing social inequalities. We don't want that. We don't want those students who just get in because parents push them to take these tests and because they could afford it. But more importantly, standardized tests valorizes knowledge that can be standardized. So what kind of knowledge is that? Knowledge that relies on problems with well-defined solutions, solvable with memory recall and application of rules. Skills that can be automated. These are precisely the skills that algorithms are so good at doing. And as a result, using algorithmic admission selects for knowledge that can be turned over to algorithms, for skills that are rapidly losing their value. Algorithms basically generating their own cannon fodder on the labor market. Here you can see some data on what parole officers use to make a decision. But there are actually, this is the most common algorithm that they use. It's called the LSIR, and it is a 54 item with 10 subscales, okay? Including criminal history, education, employment, finances, family, marital status, accommodation, leisure, and so on. Lots and lots of things. Then they create a statistical model to predict your recidivism. How well this predicts for the different groups, the correlation of this composite for the total sample is 0.245, okay? It's about 5 or 6% of the variation that is being explained here. And of course there are lots of problems. It conflates blame with risk because there are certain things that you cannot do anything about. For instance, whether your finances is not something that you can you can change from, not from the prison, but also you cannot change, for instance, your gender or age, which could be risk factors. So certain factors are beyond person's control and under control. And to the extent past behavior is a result of discrimination, using past behavior perpetuates discrimination. Okay, credit. So why not algorithms for large loans if algorithms are better predictors? Well, there are first, large sums allow for precision of measurement, where small sums, you have to have a large volume, and there is no way that you can measure that correctly, and what you do is you just sort of count on things canceling out, because the cost of failure is borne not by the bank, but all the other borrowers. So when you don't pay, it is not that the bank who has to pay, who loses the money, but everyone else who has a card is going to pay for it. You cannot have the same thing for General Motors. Black box models, lack of causation, removes discretion. But so that's very good for small lenders, because now the bank director can monitor exactly how the loans are given, because it is just given by the machine. But it also removes accountability. So if there is a huge bad loan given to GM, who would the big bank hold accountable if the computer said that you have to do that? And most importantly, big borrowers have power. If you owe the bank $1,000, you have a problem. If you owe the bank $1 million, then the bank has a problem. So they actually have to be much, much more careful, not just to make the prediction, but to sort of make sure that they lead you to payment. College. Why for students and not for professors? Well, the stakes are higher for hiring a colleague, and that needs more scrutiny. Admitting a student is less consequential and more temporary. Causal stories enable argumentation, so you can deliberate about colleagues. While with students, actually, you can just gesture towards the algorithm and tell them, well, you cannot complain because the computer just did it. Professors do have power, and universities must deal with that power. So they would not submit to an algorithmic assessment, as long as they have enough power. And the cost of error is borne directly by those who make the hire. So when you hire a colleague, but students are admitted by the university administrators. Okay. In criminal justice system, the main thing is that while you are still not in jail, you have rights. Once you are out of jail, once you are in jail, you don't have rights, so they can put you through the algorithm. But these are effective legal rights, because now there are new forms of using algorithms in the criminal justice system, which actually puts people into algorithms even though they are not arrested yet. It's another story. Okay, so what is the reason for the actuarial success? In real life, it is because models are cheaper, faster, they give more internal control over personnel, they are less intrusive, and they also create the legitimacy of mathematics and algorithms and science. None of these are about the accuracy of prediction, but of course they are a little, they can be more predictive. And now with the new big data algorithms, there you trade off interpretability and prediction. So in psychology, why did the hundreds of studies show that? What they found, the experimental situation is tailor-made for algorithmic predictions because the outcomes are well-defined, unambiguous. Prediction is mostly a one-shot game. No self-fulfilling or frustrating prophecy effects are allowed. Predictor cannot influence the outcome. No gaming the system by the predicted. And clinical judgment is hidden in model building. So it is in there, just it is sort of one step removed. So another way of putting it, demands of internal validity favors algorithms at the expense of their external validity. So my last my last part, and this will be short, is the new world of algorithmic governance. We see two ways of this governance emerging. One is what I call a market-led solution, and the other is a state-led solution. In the United States, you see this through the expansion of credit scores. There are two things that are happening. One is there is an increased off-label use of the credit scores. So you get a score based on your credit history, and then that is being used for other purposes, like hiring. It becomes a number that quantifies your character. So when you are applying for a job, they're going to ask for your credit score, and this is going to be a measure of how trustworthy you are. Car insurance premiums are based on credit scores. Rental contracts, lots of other things. So it is used off-label. But then at the same time, you will see another thing happening, which is the widening of the base of credit scores. So the original credit score that FICO creates uses only behavior, credit behavior. But now they can vacuum data from anywhere, including Facebook and your social media and your emails and everything. And the guy who was the CIO, the Chief Information Officer of Google, in 2009 left Google and created his own credit rating agency called Zest Finance. And that he is working with machine learning, and he is using more than 10,000 variables to predict your creditworthiness, including whether when you filled out your application you used uppercase or lowercase. Now, this is the market-led solution, even though this relies on large companies. Okay, so there are a few upstarts like Zest Finance, but they either quickly become big or being bought up by one of the big ones. You also have the state-led solution, which is China's emerging social credit system. It started with Union Pay, the biggest international card now in the world. Its volume is bigger than Visa or MasterCard, and I don't know how many of you has a Union Pay card, but when you land on Ferryhead, the thing that you see while you're waiting for your luggage is a big advertisement for Union Pay. So Union Pay was started in 2002, and then the government used this to gather information about purchases. And now they have, in 2014, they decided to launch a social credit system by 2020, where each and every person will have a number from 300 to 900, 950, following the FICO scoring, that would designate the person's trustworthiness. And there are pilot projects going on. The biggest private is Sesame Credit, or called Jima. And that is Alipay, the Alibaba concerns system. And basically you can sign up and you just pay with your iPhone, and then all the information that is generated and that can be accessed from your iPhone is used with your permission to calculate the credit score, and that has certain consequences. You don't have to put money down when you rent a car, or you can travel on flights first class if you have a certain number of points with a certain number. And all of these are, the Sesame Credit System has somewhere around 200 million volunteer users, who are now all scored. At the same time, there's a second project done by Ant Financial. I'm sorry, by Tencent, which is WeChat, which is their WhatsApp, and they also they're just in the tens of millions, not in the hundreds of millions. But at the same time, there are also government projects, municipal, local government projects, to score everyone. And there's a very, very entertaining variety of this. On the one hand, you will find Honest Shanghai, which is basically just they're gathering every digital information about you, including court records and everything. And then you can get to a website and it tells you what your score is, and if your score becomes very bad, then there are consequences. But then there are these smaller towns that employ pensioners who would go around and would gather information about people. They would have this little quadrille notebook. They would write down that this so-and-so returned a lost wallet, or this so-and-so is being too noisy, or one of the big things that you can sort of lose points for is if you don't visit your parents, old parents, because China doesn't have a working pension system, so they rely on filial piety. And so in the end, what you have is those notebooks go to a central office where a administrator puts in the proper numbers for everybody, makes a decision, and then it becomes automated. Okay, so this is, however, is not a project which is limited to China. There are other countries that are trying to catch up with China and follow in its footpath. Russia has now has its own credit card, and all the purchasing information about people who use that card. India is trying to create its own card, RuPay, and link all it with your government ID, and then everything from your pension and state benefits to your access to your account would be linked to that card. And Turkey and Belarus have now their own state cards. And in Turkey it's called Troy, and in Belarus there is a card called Bell card. And they are working towards a system. Okay, so conclusion. We get to the conclusion. Algorithms do great service. I don't want to create the impression that algorithms are all bad. There are fantastic uses for algorithms. I use Google. They are fantastic for accomplishing very well-defined tasks where there is a consensus about the outcome, about the problem, what is desirable and what is not. The algorithm, for instance, that creates the exchange of kidney donation, for instance, is a fantastic algorithm because it matches up donors with people who need it in a way that you cannot do without an algorithm. But it's a very well-defined problem, and everyone agrees that it's a good thing to make this matter. So algorithms do a great service where you have a clear problem definition, where model selection is not cannot be abused, when the measurement is very clear, and where there is no active agency of creating self-fulfilling and self-defeating prophecies. Clinical predictions are rapidly edged out by cheaper and, under certain circumstances, more accurate actuarial methods, but at a cost. Algorithms render a clockwork universe of Newton's time, where the future is a mechanical forward projection of what already happened. This creates polarization and amplifies inequalities. New big data algorithms trade transparency for predictive power. Predictive algorithms emerge as a new form of political governance as they become actors enforcing predictability. And so I would just like to, since I started with this image of big changes coming, I also would like to end saying that with the famous adage from Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Karr, the more things change, the more remain the same. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.